Nighttime on Still Waters. This is NB 506812, narrowcasting into the night from somewhere on Britain's waterways. 25th of April, Friday. Down in the engine bay, derusting for painting. I am once more a clumsy adolescent. My feet grow too large, and my knees and elbows get in the way. I can no longer bend as I once did. The march of time becomes visible in both the engine and my body. The engine gathers grime, I gather aches. And from time to time, we both groan. An ancient moon is on the wane. Even the moon and our night have their times of tenebrae, and share the cycle of an older tridium sacrum. There is the dying, and then once more the time of rebirth, the rising of a new light to guide our feet through the dark shadows of the night. This is the narrowboat Erica, narrowcasting into the hushed stillness of an April night, to you, wherever you are. Thank you so much for coming. It's so lovely to see you, and I was hoping you'd be here. The kettle is singing on the hob, the biscuit barrel is full, and I've kept a seat free just for you. So come inside and welcome aboard. The blackthorn blossom is pretty much over now. The white drifts of almond snow of a few weeks ago are shrunk and browning, like desultory piles of city slush. But almost seamlessly, the snowscapes of hawthorn blossom take over the hedgerows. Although here still tiny tight spheres of polystyrene white. But soon, very soon, the petals will unfurl under April and May skies of rain and cloud and forget-me-not blue. And the elder too is waiting, breath-baited and tightly coiled by the gate and fence posts. It too will spring open in great summer-scented parasols of lace and hoverflies. And down among the ladies' smock the heron struts with long-legged gait, clerically clad in chasuble grey and scholar's scoop. They eye us accusingly as we walk past. Sometimes they untangle themselves in a geometry of angles, wings, neck and legs, and fly off on deliberate, unhurried wing strokes. And sometimes they just wait for us to slip back out of their world. An irritating annoyance, like a cloud passing in front of the sun, or the unwelcome clatter of a spooked moorhen thrashing the water and scattering the fry. It's hard not to feel judged by the heron, and to be found wanting. And along the waterside, the dark, tight little blades of sedges are unfurling, soft and downy. At times their heads resemble the tails of old rats, scraggles of awkward bristles, waiting to be combed into silvery manes by the wind. And in the sun, the butterflies are out, and the air is perfumed with bee hum and nectar. And soon the buttercups will be showing. The hill where I walk with Maggie is carpeted among the sheet-cropped grass with the feathered green flames of their leaves hugging the ground, waiting their time. But for now, the rich golden yellows remain the domain of celandine and dandelion, star fields of suns amongst the green. A baby moorhen was hatched this week, and the mallards are hatching too, although a number of paired couples are still out and about together. That's not to say that eggs haven't been laid. Typically, the mother will only sit on them once the entire clutch has been laid. This is the time for them to fatten up, to get as much food as she can to take her through those long 28 days of sitting, to the hatching. Unlike some other birds, like the swan, the drake, the male, doesn't take his turn to share the incubation duties. Or like crows or rooks, bring food for the nesting mother. But then neither does he abandon her to skedaddle off with the rest of the flighty boys to cruise and brawl and catch the eye of any unattached, or attached come to that, female, as some declaim. In my experience, they stick close, guarding, staying close by, during the day often a few feet away, so as not to attract too much attention. A wary companion in the long days of sitting. His soft chunters and chuckles providing a warm oral nest for reassurance and companionship to the female. In the night, sometimes they lie side by side. The drake with one cautious eye open all the time. But hers is a month of long fast, sometimes in distressingly vulnerable sites. And the one upside of their sudden decline in numbers locally is that there does now seem to be enough good nesting positions available to them all. I've not really come across any nests yet this year, but I know that they are there. And in truth, I haven't really hunted too hard, in case I unwittingly blunder into one and disturb them. And it also means that as boaters, we can breathe a little easier, as it's unlikely to come across one having built a nest on our boat, which would mean that it becomes illegal for us to move until the eggs are hatched and the nests abandoned. Unlikely, but not impossible. So we don't let our guard down too much. But right now, in these days before the long sitting, watching the drakes accompany their females tugs at my heart. They seem to know what lies ahead, how important this time of preparation is. The cocky gaudiness and brash swagger of plumage and gait dissolves into something like the ache of commitment to another that only love can truly evoke. They're quieter, even more attentive to their partner. And it's not just about protecting them from the attentions of another drake. In a community that's not under stress from other outside factors, that doesn't seem to be so much of a problem anyway, even when there are a number of unattached juvenile males around. But it's about protecting her from the shadows that cling to this path that awaits her. I throw them a handful of oats and duck food. They swim over together, and then he moves behind her, letting her eat her fill. They chatter together constantly. He continues to hang back, circling slowly, drifting on the water, letting her eat. And it's only when she has had her fill will he come in and finish off what's left. And if there isn't, there seems to be no ill grace, no expressions of begrudgment. There is a bond here, one that goes deeper than sex or reproduction, and certainly beyond that of ownership or rights. A bond that will connect them in a way that is intrinsically emotional and physiological. A seemingly solitary figure, alone, looking a bit at a loss, standing squat-like among the grass in the haze and hush of spring rain. There's something of the sense of an old Zen hermit monk about him, as he stands unprotected under the heavens, from time to time shifting from one foot to another. And he can hear the seagulls call and the magpies rattle, and can sense the cats among the bushes and the foxes lope sly along the margin land, and still he doesn't move. There's something that holds him here, something that ties him, something that will take them both through the dangers of the long sitting. Following the last episode, Jason Polite got in contact with me to tell me about an amazing website that he discovered, which has a fascinating history of the ship that carried Mum and Dad over to Canada, the MS Seven Seas, including a time being commissioned by the US Navy in 1941 and sailing as the USS Long Island as a converted aircraft carrier, where apparently she served in the Atlantic and Pacific arenas. And the website even includes a number of photographs of her in this guise. And apparently after decommissioning, she was then renamed the MS Nellie, before then being rebuilt and upgraded and given the new name, the MS Seven Seas. So if you are interested in it, and it's certainly well worth a look at, I've added the link to the website to the program notes for the first of the episodes, the Totally Worthwhile Risk Part 1. And while I'm on the subject of the last episode, hello to LJ and Bodhi, and what a brilliant photo of Bodhi. Thank you. And also hello to Christine Hamill, and I'm really glad that you're looking forward to these episodes. And hello also to Liz and Rob in Norfolk, who over the years have heard parts of this story, but never in its full form. And it's the same for us too. Most of the stories I have heard before, but usually as standalone anecdotes that have fitted into the conversational flow. And one of the stories that we will be hearing tonight was often told, particularly by Mum. However, it's only when reading it now within its proper context that I can see why it made such a lasting impact on her. It was also lovely to hear from Kevin B. And Kevin told me about how he had to rescue some very young ducklings that were stuck in a pool and were beginning to struggle. Thank you for being so on the ball, Kevin, and for saving them. And I do seem to have rather startled quite a few people in the last episode with my shout-outs, for which I do apologise. Sorry, Liz Elvin. Sorry for the shock. But again, I think that the blame at least partly is with your husband, Mark, as listeners will probably know him better as Captain Bugwash, who hadn't warned Liz that he had written in and contacted me. And in a slightly similar vein, I had a lovely message back from Uriel Danae, and thank you for clarifying the pronunciation, Uriel. And I loved your description of listening to the podcast with your husband, Greg, in the car. And if you don't mind, I'll read it because it's so lovely. And when you think about it, it's actually so amazing. Uriel and Greg were on their way to do something concerning Uriel's work, and they were in the car. And she wrote, "As we left, Greg suggested something relaxing from our playlist, and I enthusiastically suggested your podcast, as he hasn't listened to it yet. Now, I want you to imagine two people in the San Francisco Bay Area suddenly hearing a voice from a longboat from across the pond, mentioning my name in our car. It was especially fun as my husband is a British resident." And I really loved that image and that idea. And I know that I am probably far wide of the mark, but whenever I hear the name San Francisco Bay Area, it immediately conjures in my mind images of bright white buildings against deep blue cloudless skies, wide streets lined with palm trees, and the scent of hot tarmac, coconut sunscreen and eucalyptus. And there, even as I speak, Uriel and Greg in Polaroid sunglasses glide down the Arrow Straight Boulevard in a Cadillac convertible, as wide as a king-size bed, all chrome and bright paintwork with its white-walled tires and rocket fins, and a Bakelite radio that hisses and crackles with swing and Sinatra. It's probably not quite like that, eh? But then why not? Whether coloured by imagination or not, I love the way this podcast touches small worlds like this, all over the globe. Whether it's Lee in a cabin high in the mountains with deer and elk and mountain lions and spring flowers, or Chris Hinds above those restless tides and the sea wrack and fur of Puget Sound, or Glenda in the parched dust of Australian salt flats, or Barry sheltering under the wide fenland skies where snipe and bittern call and light and water dance as one. And where you are right now, worlds so different and yet brought together by the podcast. And that brings me nicely to the comment made by another of our long-time listeners, Shambles, about that sense of connection across far-flung places around the globe. He writes, "It feels like being part of a room of chatting, welcoming people, even though they are rooms scattered around the world." And yeah, you're absolutely right, and I feel that too. And actually, I'm doubly indebted to Shambles, because as it's his birthday this year, he's decided to support this podcast and become a Lockwheeler. So welcome to the Lockwheelers. Thank you so much, and I really do appreciate it. However, he hasn't just done that, but he also wrote a really beautiful poem that celebrates the podcast called Erica's Place. And I am so deeply touched by it. And I really want to read it out now, but I'm worried that it's just going to get hidden by everything else. And I want to give it some room so that we can fully appreciate it. Therefore, I hope you don't mind if I file it away for a couple of weeks, but we will return to Erica's Place. And by the way, I love that title. And while I'm here, I have a huge apology to one of our Lockwheelers, and that's Clare Hollingsworth. Clare has been supporting this podcast for over 2 years now as a Lockwheeler. And Clare, for some reason, you've not been part of the roll call for I don't know how long, and I am so sorry. I really do apologize. And I don't know how it happened, but I made sure that you are restored to our roll of honour as the Lockwheeler. So thank you. And so thank you to all of our Lockwheelers for supporting this podcast. And they are Shambles, Clare Hollingsworth, Gabriela Maria Rodriguez-Veinotte, Kevin B., Fleur and David Mcloughlin, Lois Raphael, Tania Yorgey, Andrea Hansen, Chris Hinds, David Dirom, Chris and Alan on the narrowboat The Land of Green Ginger, Captain Arlo, Rebecca Russell, Alison on the narrowboat Maka, Derek and Pauline on Silver Fox, Anna V, Orange Cookie, Mary Keane, Tony Rutherford, Arabella Holtzapfel, Rory with MJ and Kayla, the narrowboat Precious Jet, Linda Reynolds Birkins, Richard Noble, Carol Ferguson, Tracy Thomas, Mark and Tricia Stowe, and Madeline Smith. Thank you. In the last episode, after an eventful journey, Mum and Dad had arrived safely in Canada and made their way to Toronto where they hoped to find employment. The first couple of days posed something of a challenge. Having been told before they had left that jobs in Canada were plentiful, they began to get the distinct impression that this was not to be the case. Matters were made even bleaker by the realization that their temporary lodgings in Mutual Street were situated in a red light district and was subject to regular raids by the police. They were advised to quickly find alternative accommodation. So, after scouring the local paper, they soon found an apartment in a suburb called Mimico that seemed to fit the bill. With the prospect of a new place to live in front of them, they were ready for a new page to be turned, and one that would hopefully present a more attractive and hopeful prospect. Reading Mum's accounts again, I'm struck by the fact that Mum's observations of life and the cultural attitudes that they encountered in Canada throw as much a spotlight on Britain in the late 1950s as it does actually on Canada. And reading them now, I begin to see how much she and Dad and others of her generation must have found it so difficult to come to terms with those huge social and cultural changes that were to sweep across Britain a decade or so later. Changes which even those of my generation were to simply accept as the norm. We really are witnessing here a time of acute cultural change and shifts. Canada, There and Back and Why. A totally worthwhile risk that was never regretted, taken by Mick and Erica, as seen through the eyes of Erica. Part 3. 7. Our move away from Mutual Street became uppermost in our minds, and the next morning found us boarding a streetcar heading toward the suburb of Mimico. It didn't seem to be long before we arrived at our destination, and were very pleasantly surprised at our first impressions of the place. Mimico had a slightly western look about it. The few shops which looked rather impermanent lined the wide main street, the surface of which, much to our amazement, was in a terrible state. Large potholes, etc., apparently this being the norm. We later found out that all roads in that area were in the same condition, but that didn't stop the locals from driving around at high speed in their rather battered-looking cars. And in spite of that, one didn't get the feeling of things being run down, as one would have done in England. But first to find Robert Street, where we would find the home of the dear soul to whom Mick spoke on the telephone. Fortunately, Robert Street was quite easy to find, being one of the many wide side roads off the main street. And I think our immediate impression was one of light and space. As we walked down the road, which was lined on both sides by moderately large detached houses, we noticed that all the front gardens, except one, were open plan, unfenced, and the houses stood well back, giving once again the feeling of light and space, and to a certain extent of opulence. We found the house we wanted, and on knocking on the door, met Marie Kettlewell, a vivacious young Canadian who apparently was dealing with the letting of the apartment we were after. Having introduced ourselves, she immediately escorted us over the road to the house opposite, the only one that had a high garden fence. Apparently, the house was owned by an elderly Englishwoman, and it was through her typical British desire for privacy that she insisted on this departure from the Canadian norm. She was obviously looked on as a bit of an eccentric, but now she was in a home, and rather than leave the place empty, it had been divided into 2 apartments. The upper let to a young Canadian couple, and the downstairs was at that moment empty. When we entered the apartment, we began to agree with her neighbours over her eccentricity. As with many Canadian houses, the plan was open and would have looked spacious if it hadn't been completely filled with an enormous number of Oriental and Asian artifacts of all shapes and sizes. Apparently, she and her husband had travelled extensively over the years, and the contents of their home had become something of a museum. And as there was still the possibility that the old lady could make a miraculous recovery and return home, everything had to remain in situ. Still, provided we didn't mind who our bedfellows were, there was everything there that we could want. And so we immediately paid up the first month's rent and went straight back to Mutual Street, packed our bags and left a note with the door key that we had been given, thanking them for their hospitality, etc., as there was no one at home at the time. And as we'd paid rent in advance, we felt that we could leave without further worry. And it was wonderful to feel that we now had somewhere that we could call home. And it also gave us some more hopeful feeling in the job direction. We had decided that there was not much point in my getting a job if the chances of Mick getting one was going to be as hopeless as it seemed to be. But perhaps now our luck would change. But first things first, we sorted out our immediate luggage, as much as we had of it, and now we could contact the shipping line and get our crates sent to us. But first, we needed to get some food, so we found the nearest food shop and got in some provisions. Then we contacted our shipping line, who said that our crates would be with us forthwith. Our kitchen was quite large, as it was also the dining area. But one thing that dominated it was an enormous refrigerator, completely empty except for the ice cube trays. They were full and frozen and ready for use. We didn't feel that we would be able to afford to stock the fridge in the manner it had probably been used to. As I said, the rest of the place was chock-a-block full of mementos of a different world. One other part of the house that amazed us was the basement. Every Canadian house has a basement, for this is where the giant heating systems were installed. As Mick said, it was like going down into the engine room of a liner. Down there was also our shower unit, but no bathroom. One thing that we were not used to was central heating. At that time, central heating was still a luxury in most houses in England. The central heating here was, of course, on, as it was still winter and bitterly cold outside. But we couldn't cope with, to us, the stifling atmosphere, all the windows being sealed up for the winter months. So Mick turned the thermostat down. It wasn't long before we heard hurried footsteps running down the stairs, and an anxious face of the chap from upstairs saying that they were freezing to death. The thermostat controlled the heating in the entire house. So, after many apologies, we turned it up again, and our neighbour thankfully went back upstairs to, we hoped, a happier wife. They were a young couple, we imagined newly married, and we assumed both out at work, as I don't remember ever seeing the wife. The husband was a tall, lanky chap, who in his leisure time always seemed to be loping off somewhere with a gun over his shoulder. We never found out what he shot, or why. A couple of weeks later, the weather suddenly changed, and we had a heat wave. Fortunately, by then, Mick had helped the chap upstairs to take the storm screens down, and so we were able to open the windows and get some fresh air. However, soon there was the sound of running feet coming down the stairs again, and an anxious face again. Opening our windows had dropped the temperature in our apartment. That had caused the thermostat to go full on, and they were now roasting upstairs. We did eventually get to grips with the central heating, to all our satisfactions. The next day our crates arrived, but we were a trifle put out by the remark made by the carrier, who said he wondered how long it would be before he was back to collect them again for a return back home. He said that we wouldn't be the first. But we happily went through our crates, only taking out those things for our immediate use, and one of them was my wicker shopping basket. Now we could really stock up, and we happily trotted along to the shopping parade. There were all the usual shops, small but with plenty on the shelves. It definitely had a very seasidey feel about it. We would only buy things that we strictly needed. We still had to look after our pennies. When we arrived at the checkout, the very friendly cashier completely ignored my quite, I could see now, inadequate basket, and began stowing things in a large paper carrier, much more useful for carrying the items, which here were sold in far larger quantities. But though proving totally useless, the cashier nevertheless admired my quaint basket. Another thing we noticed was that all the men were clean-shaven. For although Mick had at the time did not have the beard, he did have a moustache, which definitely made us stand out as people from another country. Apparently the severe winters with freezing ice and snows were not conducive to beards and moustaches. No Canadian ever grew them. 8. Now that we had got our home sorted out, the next most important item on the agenda was to find a job. The rate our money was disappearing made us realise that it was imperative that Mick should get some sort of work as soon as possible. There was a labour exchange in Mimico, and we immediately made our way there. And after speaking to the clerk, we filled in the necessary forms to register and discussed with him the jobs available. As had been proven by the lack of job vacancy adverts in the papers, there was really nothing he could offer Mick, and what few jobs there were in the practical line, the applicant was required to take his own tools, and these being power-assisted ones. This put Mick out of the running straight away. But Mick was told to call in daily and see if there was any change in the situation. So, with rather a heavy heart, we went back home again. And now, every morning before we did anything else, Mick would report to the labour exchange. The office was always packed out with people all looking for work, the majority of them being Canadians, and I got to the point where I tried to hide the fact that we were not Canadian. But to a certain extent, because of the large flood of immigrants over the past 6 months or so, many being of continental origin, including Hungarians who had fled from the recent uprising, the latter proving very unpopular with the Canadians, our being British was a great asset, and we were looked upon more favourably than we might have been under normal circumstances. But still we were very conscious that we were after jobs that should rightly go to the Canadians. Once we had paid our visit to the labour exchange, the rest of the day was our own, which we had to try and fill as cheaply as possible. As Mick ruefully recalls, we occupied our time by making ice cubes, the only thing we could afford to keep in the enormous fridge. But we never felt on our own, because Marie Kettlewell continued to keep a motherly eye over us, and was forever popping over to see how we were getting on, accompanied by her ever so busy small son. Her husband, Jack, was a painter and decorator, and was, in the eyes of the Canadians, a young man of substance, as he was a craftsman. He was as nice as his wife, and they would often ask us over for a meal. On one of our visits to them, we were shown over their well-appointed house, including the much-prized basement, which, of course, housed the enormous central heating furnaces. But also, to our amazement, the basement was stacked from wall to ceiling with tins of food of every description. In Jack's line of business, the winter time would be a time of hardship, as there would be no call for his services during those bitterly cold months. And so, like the large red squirrels that abounded, during the summer when Jack had plenty of work and the money was flowing in, they made sure that they got enough provisions to last them through those lean months. Besides our visiting the Kettlewells, we had kept in touch with Pat and Ron Cooper, who were staying with their friends until they got themselves sorted out. It transpired that the friends had an apartment in Don Mills, another suburb of Toronto, which was quite easy to get to, and it was arranged that on an evening when Pat and Ron would be on their own, we should go over and visit them. We looked forward to meeting up with them again, to see how their fortunes had fared. Don Mills, the suburb where they were staying, was on the opposite side of Toronto to us, and it necessitated us taking a streetcar right across the centre of the city to the farthest point of the streetcar journey. And, as far as we could make out, it was not far from where they were staying. We were getting quite used to travelling about on the streetcars now. But I don't think Mick ever got used to the fact that the groups of smart, sophisticated young ladies, many wearing makeup and full of bright chatter who boarded the streetcar at certain times of the day, were in fact high school pupils travelling to and from school. Not a bit like our demure young things back home of similar age, still wearing school uniforms. Eventually we arrived at our destination, which even to our innocent eyes proved in no way to be a suburb of anywhere. It just seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. But the conductor said that this was the terminus, and after a short interval, they would be returning to the city centre. We explained that we wanted to get to Don Mills, and he pointed us in the right direction, wished us luck, and we set off. Since we had arrived in Toronto, the weather had changed quite dramatically. When we first landed, there was slushy snow everywhere, and it was bitterly cold. But in the space of a couple of weeks or so, summer had arrived, and we were in our summer clothes. But the evenings were still chilly, and we were not sorry that we were well clad. And except for my high-heeled, peep-toed shoes, we were well equipped for walking. Still, we wouldn't have to go far. The early evening was fine, and there was still plenty of daylight. But as we walked along the edge of what seemed to be a fairly busy main road, so the countryside got more and more desolate-looking. The daylight was now going fast, and as far as we could tell, there was still no sign of any habitation at all, let alone a busy suburb. Only this terrible, bleak scrubland. We then came to a narrowing of the road and a bridge over which we had to walk, or run. The bridge was made up of well-worn tree trunks, and over this the cars sped at high speed. And so, biding our time, we dashed across singly, when, as far as we could tell, there would be no cars in the immediate future. For we now realized that this was not normally a road where the odd pedestrian would be expected, and at the rate the cars were speeding, we certainly wouldn't be noticed. And by now, it was pitch dark anyway. And once we had negotiated the bridge, we set off once more. Obviously there were no pavements, as it was right out in the country. And to make sure that we were well away from the road and the speeding cars, it necessitated us walking over very lumpy, uneven ground, making it very heavy weather for us, especially in my light high-heeled shoes, and I remember clinging on to Mick's arm, not only for comfort, but also to prevent me from tripping up. And to make matters worse, I was convinced I could hear wolves howling in the distance. The terrain certainly looked right. Suddenly, much to our relief, the lights of a lone farmhouse appeared, and thankfully we made our way down the short path to their door. As we approached the door to the farmhouse, so a great baying of dogs from inside greeted our arrival. But in spite of all the noise, no one appeared, so Mick knocked loudly, hoping and praying that there was someone, beside the dogs, at home. Soon, a man's voice called out, asking what we wanted, but making no effort to open the door to us. So Mick explained the situation as best he could, over the noise of the barking dogs and through the firmly closed door. But the only help we received was that we were on the right road, and just keep on walking. Our fears over the situation that we had now found ourselves in were not eased by the farmer's obvious reluctance to open the door to us at this time of the evening. So, dejectedly, we set off once more. We weren't even sure how much further we had to go. And then suddenly there was a fork in the road with no signs giving us any idea which fork we should take. Now we were really stumped, and there was nothing for it. We would have to flag someone down. But would anyone stop, even if they saw us? But luck was with us. Before very long, a car slowed to a halt, and we found that the occupants of the car hailed from England. I don't think any Canadian would have stopped due to the lawlessness on the roads. We ourselves had been warned that if and when we eventually had a car, never to stop on the highways, not even to help in an accident should we come across one. For as far as the police were concerned, we would be the suspect cause until proven otherwise. But our good Samaritans, on hearing our plight, told us to climb aboard, and they would take us to the apartment block where Pat and Ron were staying. We were very, very lucky. 9. Pat and Ron were appalled at the situation that we had found ourselves in, and although their friends were not there to confirm it, Ron said that they were sure that they would run us home on their return, which certainly put our minds at rest, for we would certainly have had to find an alternative way to get back to Mimico, other than the way that we had just come. So after we had recovered from our recent ordeal, we settled down to spend a very pleasant evening, catching up on all the news since we had last met. Pat and Ron's friends had been very helpful in finding a job for Ron. Apparently in Canada, when one applied for a job, one had to sell oneself, even to the extent of saying that one was competent in a certain skill, even if this was not quite true, providing, of course, that should one get the job, then one accepted the responsibility of coping with it, and hopefully not get found out. Ron, as I have previously said, was an agricultural engineer, but now he was faced with becoming a crane driver. This vacancy had appeared in the local paper, and Ron's friend knew that Ron would be quite capable of doing it, including working towards the necessary licenses that were required for this type of work. Ron said that he'd been appalled when he heard his friend, who had rung up the prospective employer on his behalf, extol Ron's expertise in crane driving, and when after the telephone call was over, he remonstrated with his friend, and the reply was, "You are in Canada now. You must do as the Canadians do." And Ron got the job, eventually getting the necessary licenses and presumably switched careers, from being an engineer to a crane driver, and thoroughly enjoying it. But I don't think that we could ever learn to live like that. And this was just one facet of Canadian life that we found contrary to our beliefs and upbringing. And the second one was that everything was on the never never, and we still felt that we could only have what we could pay for outright. And now, 40 years on, this attitude is looked upon as old-fashioned, and our lifestyle in Britain today is very similar to that which we found in Canada all those years ago. And as predicted, Pat and Ron's friends were only too pleased to drive us home. On returning from their evening out, they too had been horrified at the predicament in which we had found ourselves. We certainly were innocents abroad. This is the narrowboat Erica, signing off for the night and wishing you a very restful and peaceful night. Good night. Temperature outside 13.2 degrees. Inside 18 degrees. Humidity 77%. Dew point 8 degrees. Wind direction south-southeast. Wind strength 2 miles per hour. Barometric pressure 1023.8 rising. Cloud cover 95%. Cloud ceiling 7,600 feet. Precipitation nil. Moon phase 1.2%. Waning crescent. Day length 14 hours 38 minutes. Sunset 2024. Sky casting 5:44.